Deep beneath the towering spires and bustling marketplaces of the Hive, where sunlight had not touched metal in thousands of years, worked a man no one ever noticed. He wore a stained gray uniform, identical to thousands of others, but his name patch had long faded away. No one bothered to replace it. To most citizens, he wasn't a worker or even a person. He was just the janitor, a figure glimpsed in passing. Bent under the weight of a rusted toolkit and a mop older than he was, the corridors around him were alive with steam bursts, ancient machinery clattering like dying beasts, and pipes dripping with toxic condensation. In these forgotten levels, he moved with a quiet confidence, knowing every crooked step and faulty fuse, as if the Hive itself whispered instructions into his ear. His days followed the same rhythm, a routine carved into his bones. Dawn, if such a concept existed here, began with cleaning the waste chutes, massive metal throats that swallowed the refuse of millions. He would wedge open jammed hatches, scrape hardened sludge from inner walls, and clear tangled masses of rags, scraps, and sometimes things better left unidentified. When chutes behaved, he moved on to unclogging sludge vents, kneeling on steel catwalks slick with condensation while the industrial fans groaned overhead. Workers hurried past him without a word, often stepping around him like he was part of the machinery. Supervisors never thanked him. The administratum barely remembered his barcode number. Yet he performed each task with steady hands, never rushing, never complaining. Despite the filth and stench, there was a quiet dignity in the way he approached his work. He believed the Hive needed people like him, people who kept the lower levels functional, who prevented floods, fires, and outbreaks. It was a humble devotion, shaped by decades of living under Imperial doctrine. He carried a small, battered shrine of the Emperor in his pocket, touching it for luck before every shift. He didn't dream of glory or reward. All he wanted was to do his duty, to keep the Hive running so its citizens could live another day under the God Emperor's light. In a place where corruption, neglect, and despair were common currency, his simple loyalty was almost heroic, though no one ever noticed. But lately, the Hive had been acting wrong. He was the first to notice it, not because he was special, but because he worked where others refused to look. Some vents exhaled a sour, rotten smell that wasn't part of the usual industrial decay. Slime thickened on certain pipes, oozing in sluggish streams that defied gravity for a heartbeat before dripping down. In maintenance shafts, lights flickered with unnatural rhythm, like the Hive had developed a heartbeat. Once, while scraping residue from a vent, he found a patch of mold that pulsed faintly when touched. He wiped it away, muttering about faulty filters, but unease lingered. Something wasn't right beneath the steel skin of the city. He kept these concerns to himself, not out of fear, but because he doubted anyone would listen. People rarely heard him, even when he spoke directly to them. So he simply worked on, quietly watching, quietly worrying, and quietly hoping the oddities were nothing more than aging machines misbehaving again. But deep in his gut, a feeling grew like a slow infection. The Hive was sick, and no one except him had noticed. The first warning arrived as a smell, subtle at first, a faint sourness drifting through the metal arteries of the Hive. The janitor noticed it during his rounds, when he squeezed through a narrow maintenance tunnel, where warm air usually carried the scent of rust and machine oil. Today, however, the air was heavy and wet, clinging to his skin like breath from something alive. He paused, sniffed, and frowned. It wasn't sewage, nor chemical runoff, nor industrial fumes. This was organic rot, too old to belong here, too fresh to be ignored. The odor lingered even after he marked the area for repair. As he moved deeper into the tunnels, the smell followed, growing richer and more sinister, like something spoiled was waiting just out of sight. The next signs were the rats, creatures that infested every level of the hive. The janitor found the first one lying near a heat vent, stiff and bloated, its eyes milked over. Nothing unusual about dead vermin, but when he nudged the corpse aside with his boot, the skin rippled as though something underneath moved. Uneasy, he watched as the body swelled unevenly, grotesque lumps pushing outward. There should have been decay, smell, or insects, but there were none. The creature looked freshly killed, yet tumors budded like diseased flowers across its body. When he returned hours later, the rat was still there, unchanged, unrotting, the tumors even larger. More began appearing throughout the tunnels, clustered in corners, piled near vents, each one swollen, wrong, and untouched by time. Soon, the hive itself began behaving strangely. Timekeeping devices, essential for coordinating shifts, power cycles, and pressure controls, started failing. The janitor passed through a service station where 6 clocks hung on the wall, each displaying a different hour. He tapped one lightly, and the second hand jerked before freezing again. Another ticked backwards. Another spun in frantic circles until the glass cracked. Nearby pipes grew a thin green fuzz, soft like moss, but it clung to metal with unnatural strength. He scraped at it with his scraper. It smudged but did not break apart, stretching like wet sinew. Even the echo of machinery sounded different, dulled somehow, as if the hive's heartbeat had slowed and thickened. Every day, something new went wrong. He finally decided to report what he had seen. Carrying a sealed sample container, he climbed several levels until he reached the administratum office, a cramped chamber overflowing with data slates, incense smoke, and bored clerks. He explained the smell, the rats, the fungus, the clocks, everything. The clerk, barely lifting his eyes from his paperwork, stamped a form and shoved it back. Maintenance issue, sector aging, budget tight. Submit a request for replacement filters. When the janitor insisted something unnatural was happening, the clerk waved him off. Do you know how many complaints we get daily? If it's not a structural collapse, it's not our concern. A servo skull even hovered closer as if to usher him out. He left frustrated, unheard, and more alone than before. But the hive had other ways of proving the truth. A few shifts later, while he was purging a sludge line, a distant scream echoed down the corridor. Then another, sharp and panicked. He grabbed his lamp and jogged toward the noise, finding 2 workers pinned beneath broken piping, their tools scattered. One man was convulsing on the floor, clutching his throat. At first, the janitor thought it was a chemical burn, but then the man's skin began to bubble. Tumors erupted across his neck, swelling in seconds, splitting open to reveal glistening green tissue. His eyes sank inward, his mouth distorting into a wet gurgle. The other worker backed away, horrified, as the mutating man rose with jerking limbs and lunged at him. The janitor reacted instinctively, swinging his reinforced wrench with all his strength. The blow cracked bone and sent the mutating worker sprawling, yet he crawled forward, fingers stretching into swollen claws. A foul stench burst from his wounds, thick enough to sting the janitor's eyes. Together, he and the surviving worker managed to pin the creature long enough to crush its skull. But even then, the corpse twitched, spasming like a puppet tugged by unseen strings. When it finally went still, its body didn't bleed. It oozed a pale, gelatinous slime that pooled beneath it. The surviving worker fled in terror, refusing to speak or report what happened. The janitor was left alone with the corpse, the smell, and a heart pounding with dread. He knew now that the hive was facing something far beyond broken machines or neglected tunnels. The rot was spreading, growing bolder, pushing upward into sectors where millions lived unaware of the danger. Yet no authority believed him. No one listened, and no help would come. The janitor wiped his tools clean, though the stench lingered no matter how hard he scrubbed. As he stood in the flickering light of the maintenance corridor, surrounded by silence and distant machinery groans, a cold realization settled into his bones. Whatever had entered the hive was only beginning its work, and he was the only one who had seen it coming. By the time the lower hive erupted, it was already too late. The slums, a warren of rusted metal and shattered walkways, collapsed under their own weight, both literal and metaphorical. Makeshift homes crumbled as panicked citizens poured into narrow corridors, screaming and shoving each other in desperation. Fires ignited spontaneously, fueled by chemical leaks, while the stench of rot mixed with smoke in a suffocating miasma. Corpses littered the streets, swollen and grotesque, their eyes wide and unseeing, skin split with plague sores. Even the machinery groaned in protest, shutters banging and pipes bursting, as if the hive itself recoiled from the horror now loose within its veins. The janitor, trapped in his familiar maintenance tunnels, peered out through grated vents into the chaos above. He saw bodies twist in unnatural ways, limbs contorting as the plague took hold. Some fell, only to explode in clouds of green flies, the buzzing swarm lifting into the smoke-choked air, carrying disease and terror in equal measure. Others shambled forward, mindless and bloated, infecting anyone they touched. The stench reached even the deepest tunnels where he had spent decades working, a living reminder that the hive's foundations had been corrupted. There was no time to mourn or hesitate. Survival required constant motion, wits sharper than a lasgun bolt, and courage he never knew he possessed. In the shadows of a collapsed archway, cultists of Nurgle chanted in rhythmic unison, their voices rising and falling like a tide of corruption. Hooded and spattered with ichor, they carried grotesque relics and banners smeared with filth and blood. Their laughter echoed unnaturally through the narrow streets, drowning the cries of the terrified populace. Each chant seemed to warp the air, thickening it with nausea and dread. From his vantage in the tunnels, the janitor could see them moving systematically, directing the plague where it would cause maximum devastation. Their presence confirmed what he had feared. This was not an accident, but a deliberate, orchestrated attack from forces far beyond mortal comprehension. The janitor tried to reach the surface, to warn anyone who might listen, but the paths he knew were no longer safe. The outbreak had spread faster than anticipated, filling the streets and service shafts with nauseating clouds of spores and crawling mutants. Vent covers exploded under pressure, sending shards into walls and igniting small fires. He ducked under a falling beam, narrowly avoiding death as the tunnel behind him collapsed. Every corner brought new horror. Bloated corpses twitching with life, rats the size of small dogs, warped into grotesque forms, and fungus that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of its own. The lower hive, once a place of quiet misery, had transformed into a living nightmare. Above, the PDF, local planetary defense forces, attempted a lockdown, but they were hopelessly unprepared. Barricades went up too slowly, gates buckled under pressure, and ranks of soldiers found themselves surrounded by grotesque abominations. Bolters roared, lasguns sputtered, and flamers roared into the filth. Yet the plague continued to spread, unaffected by conventional weaponry. Civilians who hadn't been transformed ran into fire or traps, desperate to escape what had become a death maze. The janitor, seeing the futility of the military response, realized that only someone who knew the veins of the hive as intimately as he did could hope to survive or to stop the corruption from reaching the upper sectors. In the chaos, the janitor became a silent observer and unwilling participant. He guided terrified survivors through maintenance shafts, dodging the mutant horrors and the cultists' rituals. Each step forward was a gamble. One wrong move could crush him under rubble, infect him with spores, or put him in the path of a deranged worker consumed by Nurgle's gift. Every scream echoed off steel walls, bouncing back like a cruel chorus reminding him that death lurked everywhere. Yet in this despair, he noticed patterns, the way the plague moved, how the cultists concentrated their efforts, and which passages remained untouched by chaos. Knowledge, he realized, was the only weapon left in a hive gone mad. By the end of the day, entire districts of the lower hive had fallen silent, save for the wet, sickly squelch of moving horrors and the chant of the cultists. Smoke rose in thick black columns, carrying the stench of disease into every level. The janitor paused in a shaft to catch his breath, surrounded by collapsing tunnels and the distant cries of both the living and the dead. The upper hive remained untainted for now, but it was only a matter of time. As he wiped grime from his eyes and tightened the grip on his tools, he understood the grim truth. The outbreak would not stop itself, the authorities would not save the hive, and the only hope rested in the hands of a nobody who had spent his life cleaning filth no one else dared to touch. As he crouched in a flickering service shaft, the janitor felt a strange clarity amidst the chaos. Years spent crawling through maintenance tunnels, wiping grime from vent grates, and unclogging sludge lines had given him knowledge no one else possessed. Every corridor, every shaft, every hidden artery of the lower hive was mapped in his memory. While the citizens and soldiers panicked above, blindly barricading streets or abandoning their posts, he understood the labyrinth beneath their feet. He could trace the movement of air, the direction of waste flows, and the subtle shifts in pressure that revealed the hive's hidden veins. This was knowledge, born not of strategy or rank, but of decades spent invisible. It became painfully clear that this knowledge could be his only weapon. The plague that had overtaken the lower levels moved like a living tide, yet he could anticipate its spread by following the hidden pathways the public never saw. Ventilation shafts acted as conduits for spores, while clogged sludge lines harbored small pockets of infection waiting to erupt. He could predict which areas the plague would strike next, where mutations would appear, and which corridors might remain untouched for a fleeting window of safety. No PDF squad, no mechanicus engineer, and certainly no administratum clerk possessed this intimate understanding of the hive's subterranean anatomy. He remembered the locations of forgotten mechanicus nodes ancient reactors buried deep beneath the surface, their control panels coated in grime, yet still functional. A flick of a switch, a wrench turned in a precise direction, could redirect airflows or activate dormant filtration systems. Such systems were long abandoned by the upper hive, left to rot, considered unnecessary by those who did not understand their true value. For the janitor, however, these relics were tools of salvation. He could use them to contain pockets of infection, to slow the advance of the plague, or to cut off areas where cultists of Nurgle were concentrating their rituals. Every hidden valve and conduit became a lifeline in a city gone mad. Beyond machinery, his knowledge extended to the tunnels themselves. He knew where maintenance shafts narrowed into crawl spaces too small for armed men, where acid-resistant piping could serve as bridges across flooded sectors, and which dead-end vents were actually shortcuts to critical junctions above. He realized he could move faster, unseen, while soldiers were trapped in choke points, firing blindly at horrors that had already anticipated them. Each step he took became a calculated measure, guided by instinct and memory rather than maps or orders. In this chaos, his invisibility became an advantage. The Hive had always ignored him, but now that same ignorance would allow him to act where others could not. As the janitor navigated these forbidden corridors, a grim understanding settled in his mind. The Hive itself was a weapon. The very infrastructure, neglected and overlooked for centuries, could be harnessed to fight back the corruption. By manipulating airflow, sealing specific vents, or redirecting sewage flows, he could create temporary barriers to slow the spread of Nurgle's disease. He could lead small groups of survivors through passages no one else would attempt, guiding them around collapsing floors, mutant clusters, and spore clouds. His knowledge granted him the power to act where the rest of the Imperium would hesitate, paralyzed by protocol or disbelief. Yet even with this advantage, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down. One wrong choice, one misdirected valve or misjudged shortcut could doom countless lives. Every turn of the wrist, every decision had consequences far beyond his imagination. He moved with precision, checking each junction, listening to the subtle hiss of vents and the distant groans of infected creatures. The Hive whispered its secrets to him, a language only he could understand. And for the first time in his life, being a nobody gave him a purpose unlike any he had imagined. Here, in the filth and darkness, he became more than a janitor. He became the Hive's unseen guardian. Finally, standing at the convergence of several massive waste conduits, he traced the paths the plague would take if left unchecked. He could see the routes Nurgle's infection would follow to reach higher sectors, and for the first time, hope flickered in the oppressive darkness. By exploiting his knowledge of hidden shafts, filtration nodes, and forbidden tunnels, he could outmaneuver the cultists, cut off the spread, and buy the upper hive precious time. No one above would understand. No one would recognize his deeds, but that did not matter. In the heart of the inferno beneath the city, the janitor alone held the secret to saving billions from the creeping rot of Nurgle. As he followed the hidden vents and ducts deeper into the hive, the janitor stumbled upon a chamber unlike any he had seen before. The walls were slick with ichor, and glyphs of Nurgle, carved crudely yet pulsing with a sickly light, glimmered across the filth-streaked metal. In the center, cultists hovered over a massive spore generator, the device hissing and leaking green vapor that oozed into the air like living smoke. He recognized the ritual's purpose instantly, a grandfather's breath bloom, an immense release of plague spores designed to blanket the upper hive. The sheer scale of the threat made his stomach turn. If the device reached full activation, billions would perish before anyone above could even respond. He backed away, pressing against the corridor walls, heart pounding as he considered the weight of the situation. There was no chance to call for reinforcements. Even the nearest Space Marine squad was days away, and the PDF above was collapsing under the spreading chaos. Any attempt to intervene openly would result in instant death. The janitor understood the grim calculus. The only way to stop the apocalypse was to reach the reactor manually, to shut down the mechanisms himself, in the bowels of the hive, where even the cultists did not linger for long. The reactor was ancient, a relic of forgotten Mechanicus engineering, its interface alien and delicate, requiring knowledge he barely possessed. Fear clawed at him, a physical presence pressing against his chest. Death was certain. Every story of the hive's lower levels carried the same warning. Descend too far, touch what should not be touched, and you are gone. Yet above that fear burned something else, a glimmer of duty that had never required applause. He thought of the billions living above him, oblivious to the creeping green terror that would engulf them. Fathers, mothers, children, the dying, the sick, the blind, the countless unnoticed lives that depended on the hive functioning. He was nobody, invisible to the world above, but that did not absolve him. He was their last hope. He mapped the path in his mind, tracing each vent, conduit, and maintenance shaft he had memorized over decades. The route was treacherous, collapsing floors, fungal growths that acted like glue, mutant swarms bred by the spreading plague. One wrong step could send him plummeting into an acid-soaked pit or trigger a latent spore eruption that would suffocate him instantly. Cultists were patrolling in unpredictable patterns, yet he had no choice but to cross their lines. His tools, mop, wrench, and improvised lockpicks would be all that stood between him and certain death. He gritted his teeth and began, knowing that hesitation could doom the entire hive. The closer he drew to the reactor, the stronger the sickly hum of machinery and the acidic tang of Nurgle's corruption became. Pipes pulsed as if alive, dripping green fluid that hissed on contact with metal floors. The air was thick, spores floating in invisible clouds that made his eyes water and lungs burn. He navigated through crawl spaces barely wider than his shoulders, dodged vents spraying corrosive steam, and clambered over tangled heaps of mutating corpses. Each step was a battle of wills. The hive itself seemed to resist him, testing him, reminding him that survival was not a guarantee and that the weight of billions rested entirely on the decisions of a single, forgotten worker. He reached the outer edge of the reactor chamber and peered through a cracked viewport. The generator's core spun slowly, a sickly green light pulsing from its center, almost like a heartbeat. The cultists were engaged in a chant, their voices rising in a rhythmic horror that made the walls seem to vibrate. He realized that he could not fight them. Too many, too strong. Their forms bloated and resistant to conventional weapons. Every second spent hesitating allowed the spores to drift upward, creeping closer to the upper hive. He understood that the only solution was direct intervention. He would have to enter the chamber, manipulate the ancient controls, and pray that his decades of janitorial experience had prepared him for Mechanicus machinery designed to be tamper-proof for centuries. The janitor drew a deep breath and clenched his wrench, feeling the weight of the impossible choice pressing down like the walls of the tunnels themselves. One wrong movement, one miscalculated turn of a valve, and he would die alone. The hive would fall, and billions would perish. No one would ever know his name or honor his sacrifice. The Imperium above would never credit a janitor. Yet the alternative was unthinkable. For the first time, the truth of his life crystallized. Though invisible to the world, he was the only one capable of stopping this catastrophe. And so, with grim resolve, he began the final deadly descent into the heart of the reactor, where death and salvation waited hand in hand. The janitor began his descent into the underhive, deeper than any civilian had dared venture in centuries. The air grew thick and foul, tasting of decay and chemicals long dead. Each step echoed unnaturally in the metal corridors, bouncing back as distorted whispers, some real, some imagined. The lights on his headlamp flickered weakly against the walls, which seemed to pulse subtly, as if the very steel were breathing. Shadows stretched and twisted with every step, teasing his eyes with movement that wasn't there. The smell of rot thickened, carrying hints of sulfur and sickly sweet fungus that made his stomach churn. Alone, he felt the oppressive weight of the hive pressing down, and the enormity of his task became frighteningly real. Soon, the first horrors emerged. Plague mutants, humanoid but grotesquely deformed, crawled along walls and ceilings, their skin bursting with pustules, eyes white and milky. They snarled with wet, gurgling voices as they lunged for him, claws tearing through steel and flesh alike. The janitor dodged instinctively, swinging his wrench with desperate precision, smashing bones and breaking skulls. Each blow required all his strength, yet he knew that the creatures were only partially destroyed by force. Their bodies writhed even in death, driven by corruption that mocked life itself. The echoes of his strikes mingled with their inhuman cries, creating a rhythm of terror that followed him as he advanced further into the bowels of the hive. Deeper still, the underhive twisted into spaces impossible for ordinary humans. Corridors narrowed into crawl spaces, forcing him to slide on hands and knees through walls slick with mold and slime. Worm hulks emerged from fissures in the tunnels, immense, segmented horrors whose bodies oozed ichor and secreted acidic fluids that hissed upon contact with metal. He swung his mop to deflect strikes, jabbing and jabbing at the writhing monstrosities, only to retreat when they surged forward. Cleaning solvents became weapons of necessity, sprayed into the eyes of creatures to blind them temporarily, granting him a precious few seconds to crawl further. Every step was a gamble, and he moved with the precision of someone intimately familiar with every twist of the hive's veins. Even more terrifying were the corrupted priests, once human servitors now swollen with infection, chanting deliriously in the shadows. Their voices rose and fell in nauseating cadences, summoning plagues of insects that swarmed toward him with uncanny coordination. The janitor pressed into a maintenance hatch, listening as the choruses of unholy devotion rattled the walls and floor. He realized that brute force alone would not carry him through. Stealth, cunning, and speed were as important as courage. With his mop held like a staff and wrench at his side, he slithered along the ducts, avoiding patches of mold that whispered indecipherable threats, each fungus-covered wall seeming to mock his intrusion into their corrupted domain. The tunnels themselves became hostile, Steel walls seemed to pulse and breathe, exhaling fetid air that smelled of decayed corpses and overripe vegetation. Mold whispered in voices he couldn't understand, calling him names, promising safety if he turned back, or death if he proceeded. Flies crawled beneath his skin, gnawing subtly, making him itch and flinch involuntarily. Water pooled in the floors, slick and contaminated, reflecting his pale light in distorted, monstrous reflections. He fought the urge to panic, forcing his mind to focus on each handhold, each footstep, and every shadow. Loneliness gnawed at him more than fear. Even when screaming horrors surrounded him, there was no one to rely on but himself. Hours, or was it days, passed indistinguishably as he traversed the ever-changing labyrinth. The deeper he went, the more alien the underhive became. Pipes warped into impossible angles, vents opened to pits with no floor, and machinery long dead groaned like something alive. Wormhulks erupted from fissures, mutated humans lunged from hidden recesses, and cultist shadows danced in torchlight that never touched the floor. He improvised constantly, swinging wrenches, blocking strikes with mops, and using cleaning acids to slow enemies. Each encounter left him more battered, bruised, and nauseated. Yet he pressed forward, driven by the knowledge that billions above depended on the success of his impossible journey through this living nightmare. At last, standing at a junction where several tunnels converged, the janitor paused, gasping for breath. The walls seemed to lean closer, the mold and rot whispering accusations and promises of despair. His skin itched beneath crawling insects, his hands slick with grime and blood. Yet despite the horror, despite the impossibility of the path, he felt a grim sense of purpose. Every step forward, every swing of his improvised weapons, every moment of courage in utter isolation had brought him closer to the reactor. Alone, terrified, and battered, he pressed onward, knowing that only by descending fully into the heart of this underhive hell could he hope to confront the nightmare at its source and save the hive above. The janitor finally arrived at the core of the underhive, where the machinery groaned and hissed like some titanic, breathing organism. At the center, a massive, pulsating mass of flesh and metal writhed on the edges of reality, a proto great Unclean One, attempting to manifest through the bio-reactor. Its skin was blistered and glistening, tumor-like growths sprouting across its surface, while veins of sickly green energy surged along its body. The air shimmered with corruption, spores floating in dense clouds that choked the lungs. The cultists' chants had ceased, replaced by the wet, gurgling cries of the emerging daemon. The janitor gritted his teeth, knowing that hesitation here meant total annihilation for the entire hive. Plague horrors poured from hidden tunnels, writhing masses of disease and mutation, drawn to the source of their daemon master. Their limbs were twisted, their faces unrecognizable as once human, and their stench was so overpowering it made the janitor gag. Armed with nothing but a mop, a wrench, and improvised cleaning acids, he fought desperately. He swung, jabbed, and sprayed, each motion calculated to repel the monsters long enough to reach the reactor controls. The creatures were relentless, their numbers seeming infinite, and with every strike, he felt the encroaching weight of exhaustion. Yet he pressed on, understanding fully that stopping the daemon required more than brute strength. It required precision, timing, and courage beyond human measure. As he approached the reactor interface, The janitor's body betrayed him. Spores from the surrounding horrors had already begun infecting his lungs and skin, swelling pustules along his arms and neck. Pain seared through his muscles with each movement, but he ignored it. The ancient override controls were unlike anything he had encountered, covered in alien scripts and archaic mechanisms designed to frustrate any meddler. Sweat and blood mixed on his hands as he worked the levers and dials, pressing switches only after carefully observing their feedback. The proto-daemon writhed closer to manifestation, a foul, living shadow consuming space and light. And yet he continued, each precise motion a defiance against the encroaching corruption that promised to end him. The mass of the great Unclean One surged violently, throwing machinery and debris across the chamber. Bolts of corrupted energy lanced outward, knocking the janitor to the ground, his body scraping against jagged metal. With trembling hands, he scrambled back to the controls, feeling the infection in his veins, turning him into something monstrous, even as he fought. He activated the first series of override switches, sending shockwaves of energy through the reactor. The daemon roared, a sound so unnatural it shook the walls of the chamber and made the blood run cold. The janitor gritted his teeth and staggered upright, forcing himself to continue. The hive's survival depended on every agonizing second, and he would not falter despite the certainty of death. With the reactor now partially under his control, he initiated the Purification Fire Purge, ancient flames designed to incinerate both machinery and flesh alike. Heat seared the chamber, metal warped, and spores ignited into green sparks that hissed and exploded in the air. The proto-daemon shrieked in rage and pain, its form convulsing as the flames tore at its half-manifested body. The janitor's vision blurred from infection and heat, each breath a struggle. Yet he pushed forward, sliding levers, pressing buttons, and guiding energy flows. Every movement was a gamble. One wrong adjustment could overload the reactor, destroy the chamber, and doom the hive. Sweat, blood, and filth mixed into a haze as he became the final bulwark against annihilation. As the last purification sequences engaged, the proto-daemon convulsed violently, its massive bulk collapsing inward, writhing and screaming in unnatural agony. Plague horrors faltered and fled into collapsing tunnels, unable to withstand the intense fire wave. The janitor stumbled, infection burning through his body, vision clouded by sweat and pain, yet a grim satisfaction filled him. He had delayed the daemon, contained the outbreak, and redirected the reactor's energy to purge the most critical sections of the hive. He knew survival was impossible. The combination of infection, exhaustion, and the remaining corruption in the chamber would claim him. Still he lingered, ensuring that the final sequences were executed with absolute precision, holding the line against chaos itself. Finally, as the chamber began to collapse under heat, fire, and the remnants of the daemon's writhing form, the janitor leaned against a scorched wall, gasping and barely able to stand. The proto-great Unclean One lay defeated, its essence flaring and dissipating into the purifying flames. His body was ravaged by spores and burns, a testament to the unimaginable struggle he had endured. No one above would know his name. No record would commemorate his sacrifice, yet he smiled faintly through the pain. The hive above had been spared, billions alive because a nobody had confronted death itself. His last thought, as darkness closed in and the infection claimed him, was simple. The hive is clean, the Emperor's light endures, and I have done my duty. The reactor purged the lower sectors of the hive in a roaring wave of flame and energy. Corridors that had once carried the stench of rot and corruption were now illuminated in blazing heat, incinerating the worst of the plague and cleansing the ancient ducts. Mutated horrors writhed and screamed, their twisted forms melting into pools of green ichor under the relentless fire. The janitor, battered, burned, and infected, could feel the heat singe his skin even through his protective layers. The walls shook with the power of the purge, reverberating through the hive like the heartbeat of a world being reborn. Every pulse, every hiss of vented steam carried the unmistakable scent of destruction, but also relief. Cultists who had orchestrated the outbreak were thrown into panic. Their chants faltered, voices trembling as their precious rituals were torn apart by the purifying energies. Some tried to flee into the corridors, only to be consumed by the flames or crushed under collapsing beams destabilized by the reactor's surge. Others clawed at the walls, screaming for aid that would never come, their grotesque forms writhing helplessly as they succumbed to their own corrupted bodies. The janitor, moving through scorched ducts and vents, glimpsed their horror-stricken faces and knew that the hive would live because they could not finish their dark work. For a fleeting moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the nightmare would finally end. At the center of the purge, the proto-daemon convulsed violently, trapped between the collapsing reactor and the inferno consuming its flesh. It shrieked in agony, a sound so alien and terrible that the steel walls themselves seemed to vibrate with its torment. Its massive, bloated body was torn apart by the purifying fire, pustules rupturing and releasing thick clouds of corrupted spores, only to be instantly incinerated. The janitor staggered closer, gripping his wrench like a lifeline, his own body screaming with pain as infection and burns ravaged him. He knew this was the final act. The daemon would not survive, and the hive's salvation hung by a thread woven from fire, courage, and sacrifice. The outbreak, which had spread through the lower sectors with relentless speed, began to falter. Mutated corpses ceased rising. Vents once clogged with fungal blooms opened clean, and the thick, suffocating air slowly cleared. The wave of death and corruption receded, leaving only the scorched remnants of what had been. The janitor moved carefully through the chaos, every step burning through already damaged skin. Above him, the upper hive remained untouched, the citizens unaware of how close they had come to annihilation. Relief was mingled with exhaustion, and he felt a profound solitude, knowing that the hive had been spared by a nobody. By him alone, he sank against the cold, scorched wall of a maintenance shaft, breathing raggedly, the pain in his lungs and muscles overwhelming. His body was a map of burns, blisters, and oozing infections, yet his mind remained clear, focused on the success of the purge. The realization of what he had done washed over him, billions alive, because he had known the hidden paths, the forbidden conduits, and the long-forgotten mechanisms that no one else would dare touch. Around him, the echoes of dying cultists and collapsing tunnels filled the air, a grim symphony of both loss and victory. The hive was safe, for now, and he had been the invisible instrument of that salvation. A faint smile touched his cracked lips as he whispered to himself, feeling the heat of the reactor fade and the hive begin to settle into a strange, uneasy calm. His vision blurred from infection and exhaustion, yet he felt a deep, unshakable satisfaction. This was the culmination of decades spent cleaning, maintaining, and observing the underhive, unnoticed by all but the filth he had removed. The hive was purified, the demon destroyed, and the cult defeated. Though his body would not endure, his purpose had been fulfilled. The janitor's heart beat slowly, each pulse echoing the hive's reclaimed rhythm, a testament to courage born not from power or glory, but from quiet, unassuming dedication. Finally, as the last tremors of the purge subsided and the fires slowly died, the janitor lay back against the cold steel floor, his body broken, burned, and poisoned by the lingering spores. Yet he smiled faintly, a rare, genuine expression of peace amidst the horror. Around him, the hive began to breathe again, corridors cleared of plague, vents purified, machinery whirring as if in gratitude. He whispered, barely audible above the settling rubble, "This hive, my home, is clean now." His eyelids closed for the final time, infection claiming him completely. But his last thought was not of fear or pain. It was of duty fulfilled, of billions spared, and of a world that would continue because one invisible man had faced the impossible and won. The Space Marines arrived hours after the fires had died, bolters slung across massive armored shoulders, their ceramite shining faintly against the smoke-choked air. They moved cautiously through the scorched lower hive, stepping over melted corpses and twisted machinery that had once been conduits for life and labor. The stench of burned flesh and purification fire still clung to the corridors, a silent testament to the apocalypse narrowly avoided. They surveyed the devastation in grim silence, noting the absence of active cultists or demonic presence. The hive had survived, but at a cost that none present could yet comprehend, nor fully grasp in the shadows of their armored judgment. Mechanicus servitors scuttled alongside the Space Marines, recording and scanning every twisted conduit and burned vent for anomalies. Their data slates whirred, analyzing residue, logging heat signatures, and noting the traces of corrupted matter now destroyed. Among the logs, they discovered anomalies in the reactor systems, override sequences that should have been impossible for human hands to operate. Every record indicated that the purge had been triggered intentionally, yet by no sanctioned operative. The energy readings, the precise calibration of valves, the sequence of actions, everything pointed to one conclusion. The hive had been saved not by high command or specialized troops, but by an unknown individual whose actions would never officially be credited. Imperium officials, arriving later to assess the disaster, studied the reports with bureaucratic detachment. After careful deliberation, they marked the event as an extraordinary intervention of the machine spirit, the sacred essence of the reactor itself. No man had been credited, no hero's name recorded in the annals of the Administratum. This was deliberate. To the Imperium, such acts of unseen valor were often reclassified, sanitized, and attributed to divine forces rather than mortal hands. The Janitor, whose courage, knowledge, and sacrifice had saved billions, was erased from the official history, remembered only by data points, by charred metal, and by the faint trace of his passage through the hive's labyrinthine arteries. Yet not all had forgotten. A small, wide-eyed girl who had once watched him clean vents in her sector, whose family had often relied on his quiet assistance, knelt at a makeshift shrine deep in the lower hive. It was crude and handmade, carved from scraps of metal, adorned with a small candle flickering in the dim light. She remembered the janitor's gentle words, his tireless dedication, and the way he had guided her safely through floods and collapsed passages long before the plague outbreak. In her memory, he remained not a nobody, but a protector, a man whose quiet acts of service had shielded her world from horrors beyond comprehension. The girl whispered his name softly, even though no one else would hear it, and traced her fingers along the small shrine. She placed a tiny token beside it, a scrap of cloth shaped into a symbol of the Emperor, her way of honoring him in a world that would never recognize his deeds officially. The hive above her moved on unaware of the mortal who had saved it, consumed by routine, commerce, and the politics of survival. Yet in the underhive, where the air still smelled faintly of scorched filth and burned spores, the janitor's presence lingered, not in glory or records, but in the knowledge that someone had cared enough to act, even when no one else could or would. The Imperium's narrative would never include the janitor's name. Space Marines would patrol, Mechanicus would log, and administratum clerks would reclassify the incident as divine intervention, all without a human credit. To the galaxy, it was as if the hive had been cleansed by the will of the machine's spirit, by divine providence, rather than the hands of a humble, invisible servant. Yet the girl's remembrance and the faint imprint in the hive itself remained. The corridors were cleaner, the vents functioning better, and the scars of corruption, though immense, were a testament to what one unseen hand could accomplish. The hive had survived, not through glory, but through perseverance, knowledge, and courage unacknowledged by history. In the quiet aftermath, the fires extinguished, the plague halted, and the hive beginning to breathe again, the truth lingered only in the shadows. No banners would be raised, no songs sung in his honor. Only a single child remembered, and the silent walls of the lower hive bore witness to his sacrifice. The janitor's life had been given, his body lost to infection and flame. Yet the city lived because of him. In the grim darkness of the Imperium, where records are rewritten and heroes forgotten, greatness was not born of glory or accolades, but of those who faced the filth no one else would confront. And so, in a small flickering shrine beneath the hive, one handmade tribute whispered the truth. The janitor had saved them all. The fires had died. The green miasma of plague had been driven back, swallowed by purification flames and the relentless will of one unseen hand. Above, the hive stirred, unaware of the calamity it had narrowly avoided. Space Marines patrolled scorched corridors, Mechanicus servitors recorded anomalies, and administratum officials scrawled their notes. In every report, every analysis, the story was sanitized, attributed to the intervention of the machine spirit. To divine providence, no name would be recorded, no hero would be celebrated. And yet, the hive lived. Down in the lower levels, in the shadows between twisted conduits and scorched metal, a single handmade shrine flickered in candlelight. A little girl knelt before it, her eyes wide with remembrance and awe. She whispered his name softly, tracing her fingers over the crude symbol of the Emperor, placed there beside scraps of metal. To her, he was not a nobody. He was a guardian, a protector, the invisible hand that had guided her safely through filth, fire, and rot. He had faced the impossible and survived, long enough to save billions above, if only in secrecy. And then Silence. The hive exhaled a long, trembling breath, the heartbeat of machinery and steel slowing to a wary rhythm. The janitor, broken, burned, and infected, had vanished into memory and shadows. Yet his courage lingered, in the purified ducts, in the faint hum of restored machinery, in the courage of those who would live another day because of him, in the grim darkness of the Imperium, where glory is rare and deeds are often forgotten. Greatness is not born of accolades or ceremony. It is born of those who face the filth, the rot, and the horrors no one else dares to touch. He was one such soul. He had saved them all.